All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into a civilization that's been requested quite a bit by you, the listener, the Maya.
Fascinating civilization.
And we're going to be looking at the text, A Civilização Maya. Now, I should say up front, I don't speak Portuguese, but thankfully it's been translated, so we'll be looking at that.
Wonderful.
And as always, we're going to be focusing on giving you a really solid overview of the Maya, using this as our source, not getting too bogged down.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think it's also important to remember that when people think about pre-Columbian America, they often think of the Aztecs or the Incas, but the Maya, they had a deeper history in Mesoamerica,
Oh, for sure.
this area that encompasses parts of Mexico and Central America.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the Aztecs and Incas, they were kind of the new kids on the block, whereas the Maya had this whole rise and decline and transformation. So we're going to kind of cover the whole thing. We're going to start with the peopling of the Americas, agriculture, then we'll look at the Olmec, and then we'll get into the Maya in the highlands and the lowlands.
It's going to be a really amazing journey.
Yeah, and then, of course, the classic Maya period, they're most known for, and then their decline, and the post-classic Maya. We're going to cover the whole thing.
And I think you'll be really interested to learn about things like the Maya calendar.
Oh, yeah?
And their astronomy, which were both very complex and sophisticated for their time.
Definitely. All right, so let's jump right back to the beginning with the peopling of the Americas. So our source says that it was probably 30,000 to 40,000 years ago that people first arrived in the Americas, and it seems like most of them came from Asia.
Right, over the Bering Strait, which back then wasn't a strait, but a land bridge, because there was so much ice.
It's kind of amazing to think about, that whole area being a land bridge. But it also says that there might have been some later contacts across the Pacific. Maybe not huge migrations, but some kind of contact.
Yeah, it's fascinating to consider that.
And, when they first got to the Americas, they lived as hunter-gatherers, hunting, fishing, gathering wild plants. And they were developing skills like basketry and weaving, and they were making stone tools.
We actually have evidence of mammoth hunting at Tepexpan.
Wow.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
Definitely. Then around 8000 BCE, the glaciers retreated.
Right, and that land bridge disappeared.
Yeah, essentially isolating the Americas.
And that means that all these pre-Columbian cultures, they evolved without much contact with the rest of the world.
For thousands of years.
Yeah.
Then around 7000 BCE, we start to see agriculture emerging in Mesoamerica. And it looks like changes in the climate and the decline of some animal populations might have caused this shift.
Makes sense. If you can't hunt as much, you need to find other food sources.
Yeah. And of course, they gradually domesticated plants like maize, beans, and squash. They call that the Holy Trinity, which I love.
It's a great way to put it.
Right. And they're also growing chili peppers, tomatoes, avocados.
But don't forget about the animals. They had turkeys and the Escuintli.
Oh, right, the Mexican hairless dog.
Exactly. But out of all those foods, maize was definitely the most important.
It really seems to have been central to their culture, even deified.
It was considered an invention, a miracle even. And when you think about it, starting with this tiny little plant.
And turning it into what we know as corn today.
It really is pretty miraculous.
Absolutely. And as they were becoming more settled and agriculture was taking hold, they were also developing more elaborate ways of treating their dead. They started burying their dead near where they lived.
Really creating a connection to their land.
Yeah, and they were developing these ideas about an afterlife and this need for eternity.
Makes you wonder about the development of their belief systems.
Definitely. And we start to see these semi-permanent settlements popping up between 3400 and 2300 BCE in places like Tamaulipas.
The Tehuacan and Oaxaca valleys.
Yeah.
And in the lake region of the central Mexican plateau, we even find the oldest terracotta figure from around 2300 BCE.
Wow. Okay, so now let's move on to a civilization that had a huge impact on the Maya, the Olmec. They emerged on the Gulf Coast around 1500 to 400 BCE. And our source describes them as the first, big cultural force in Mesoamerica.
They were certainly impactful, but we should acknowledge that our understanding of them is relatively recent.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the research has been done since 1940,
Yeah.
and there's still debate about how much they influenced later civilizations. Were they the mother culture or not?
Right.
But regardless, they were pretty impressive, especially compared to the other cultures around at the time.
Yeah. Our source makes it clear that they were doing things that others weren't. So between 1500 and 1200 BCE, most people were living in small villages, and their social structures were pretty basic.
And their religion, it was mostly focused on ancestor worship.
Yeah, but then, around 1200 BCE, The Olmecs started building these big ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta.
And these weren't just simple villages.
No, they were doing these huge earthworks, modifying the natural landscape.
Yeah, they were transporting mud to make adobe bricks, leveling areas, building pyramids.
And they were making reservoirs and canals.
Some of the stones they used, they came from over 100 kilometers away.
Imagine that.
And remember, they didn't have metal tools. They were still in the Neolithic period.
It's hard to imagine how they did it. But they were also making these massive basalt sculptures.
Yeah, some of them weighed up to 25 tons. Think about how long it must have taken to quarry those, transport them, carve them, and polish them.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And they didn't stop there.
No, they were also making these beautiful sculptures out of jade, jadeite, serpentine.
They were really pushing the boundaries of what was possible at the time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the art that was influential.
No, the Olmec also seemed to have developed a lot of the principles that would shape classic Mesoamerican urban planning. We see the beginnings of organized public spaces.
They were using pyramids and platforms to define plazas and ceremonial areas.
And they had these open-air markets called tianguas.
So it was like a whole public life was emerging.
Exactly. And there's a clear sense of symmetry in their planning.
Oh, yeah, those visual axes we've talked about before.
Right. They were probably paying attention to astronomical observations.
And they were building pyramids to elevate their sacred structures.
Of course, we have to remember that the temples and palaces themselves were probably made of perishable materials, so we don't have those anymore.
But we can still get a sense of the grandeur. And their religion was also evolving.
Right. They moved beyond just ancestor worship. And one of their most famous motifs is the man-jaguar.
Half human, half jaguar.
Exactly. And some scholars think that a lot of the later Mesoamerican deities came from that.
Like the rain gods and the corn gods.
Right. And some even see representations of deities like sheep and Ehecatl. So their mythology was becoming more complex, and so was their influence. They weren't just staying on the Gulf Coast.
No, their influence spread in several directions. It went to the Mexican plateau, to Oaxaca, and importantly, south into the Maya area.
And that influence had a really long-lasting impact.
Yeah, our source points out that it really wasn't until the late pre-classic period, from 800 BCE to the beginning of the Common Era, that we see the full impact of the Olmec.
That's when all these regional traditions started to emerge. You have Cuculco in the Valley of Mexico.
And Monte Alban in Oaxaca.
And, of course, the Maya.
Right, but their development was a little more complex.
A bit more of a slow burn.
But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about geography, because the Maya territory was pretty big. It was centered on the Yucatan Peninsula, and it was divided into the highlands and the lowlands.
And culturally, we can divide it into three main areas: the south, the central, and the north.
So the southern area is basically the Guatemalan highlands and the Pacific coast. It's got a temperate climate, good resources.
It was really important in the early stages, but became a bit more marginal later on.
Then you have the lowlands, which are mostly below 600 meters in elevation.
And the southern lowlands, also known as the central area, that's where you find the dense rainforest.
That's where Tikal is, right?
Exactly. And that whole area from Tabasco to Belize and Honduras, that's the heartland of the classic Maya world.
But then the northern lowlands, that's the Yucatan Peninsula. It's mostly flat, limestone, not much water.
And the climate gets drier as you move northwest.
So it's kind of amazing that the classic Maya civilization really thrived in these lowland environments, which were tougher than the highlands.
You would think they would have preferred the more fertile area.
Right. But no, the central area, that's where it all happened. And we start to see semi-permanent villages popping up around 1500 BCE.
And we find early pottery styles like Bara and Ocos.
With those spherical shapes and the striated decoration.
Yeah, very distinctive. And people were moving towards El Salvador and migrating into Belize.
But it really wasn't until the late pre-classic, around 800 BCE, that we see the lowlands really getting populated.
A long time before the classic period.
Now, about the Maya people themselves, it seems like they originated from what is now the western U.S.
They settled in the southern area way back in the 3rd millennium BCE, and they probably spoke a language related to Tanakh and Zope.
And that language eventually diversified into all the different Maya languages. You have Yucatec in the north,
Chol in the central area.
Quiche in the highlands.
Right, and even the Aztec language came from the same family.
Amazing. So there was this period from about 600 BCE to the beginning of the Common Era, where we see interaction between the Olmec, Monte Alban, and the Southern Maya.
And that interaction led to the decline of Olmec dominance and the rise of these regional cultures.
So Monte Alban, They really started to take off during this time. They're reshaping mountaintops, building with stone, using lime mortar.
And their religion was getting more complex, too. We see deities like Cochillo, Pitaucozobi, Huehueteotl.
And this is also where we see the first real glyphic texts in Mesoamerica.
The Danzantes reliefs, those are fascinating.
And meanwhile, the southern Maya were developing their own monumental ceremonialism at sites like Chiapa de Corzo, Tonalá, Izapa.
This is the period often called Izapa, although it wasn't just limited to that site.
Right, it was more of a regional phenomenon. And we see the emergence of these really unique styles. Like at Izapa, they started erecting stelae with altars.
They got that from the Olmec, but the stelae were starting to revolve towards the classic Maya form, though they still had that Olmec influence.
Like those distinctive eyebrows and that prominent upper lip.
Yeah, and those mythological creatures, they were a mix of serpent, jaguar, and bird.
And the scenes were becoming more dynamic.
Definitely. And that Izapa style with all those veloute-ending elements.
This is like a precursor to the more sensual style we see later on.
Exactly. And those mystical scenes, often framed by a celestial band and a terrestrial plane.
But one thing that's different from the Olmec is the lack of high relief.
Right. It's mostly low relief, with a few exceptions, like those zoomorphic altars and the Monte Alto sculptures.
It's this Appa style. It actually spread back to the Olmec region.
Yeah, you see it at Monte Alban and even Chalcatzingo.
Amazing. Then you have Kamaljiu, which had hundreds of mounds. It was one of the biggest sites of the late pre-classic.
And they were building these elaborate tombs with rich offerings.
And this is also where we see the development of a numerical and glyphic writing system.
The Miraflores phase was crucial for that.
And although the origins of this system are still debated, it seems like it came from somewhere in the area between Prezapotes, Monte Alban, and Chalchuapa.
That's fascinating.
It is. And then around the beginning of the Common Era, we see this system evolving into what we call the long count.
The initial series.
All right. And the Maya, they were the ones who really perfected it.
And speaking of new developments, around the same time that the Olmec were declining and Monte Alban was flourishing, we see the rise of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico.
And they weren't messing around. They built the Pyramid of the Sun, which is still one of the largest pyramids in Mesoamerica.
And their city, it was massive.
The first real city in the pre-Columbian world.
And they exerted their influence in every direction, including the Maya area.
But while all of this was happening, the Maya in the lowlands were quietly laying the foundations for their own civilization.
And they were doing it in a really challenging environment.
Okay, so now let's talk about the Maya in the Piton. This is the heart of the classic Maya civilization.
And as we mentioned earlier, it's not an easy place to live.
It's got this limestone bedrock, thin soil, seasonal swamps, limited water sources.
And a dense rainforest with all kinds of trees.
And they had to import salt from far away.
It really is remarkable that they were able to thrive there.
It is. And yet they managed to develop incredible skills in astronomy and mathematics.
And they created some of the most stunning art in Mesoamerica.
So we start to see evidence of human occupation in Piton around 800 to 600 BCE at sites like Altar de Sacrificios, Cebal,
And Barton Ramey.
Yeah. And Tikal, it seems to have been settled around 600 BCE. They were already trading obsidian and quartzite.
And they probably chose that location because it was slightly higher than the surrounding areas.
And because it had chert deposits, which they used to make tools.
Right. And around 200 BCE, Tikal started building its ceremonial center.
And they kept adding to it for centuries.
Until it became the biggest Maya city. But at this point, it was mostly architecture.
They didn't really start with the monumental sculptures until later.
Right. And one of the best examples of this early architecture is the North Acropolis at Tikal.
It started as a simple platform.
Yeah, just a meter high, but they kept adding to it. And by the 1st century BCE, they were building platforms over 2 meters thick.
And they were using them for burials, too.
Right, with rich offerings. And then they started experimenting with corbelled vaulting.
That's that technique where they overlap the stones to make a kind of arch.
Exactly. And that would become a key feature of Maya architecture. And around 1 CE, we see those characteristic Piton features emerging.
Like those recessed planes and re-entrant angles.
Right. And the temples were getting more complex with multiple rooms.
But they were still using perishable materials for the roofs.
For the most part, yeah. But in some smaller temples, they were starting to use corbelled vaults.
So a unique style was emerging. But you can still see influences from the south, from places like Abashtakalik, Izapa, Kamaljuyu.
It's possible that the Tikal elite actually came from the south.
And we even have some mural paintings from this period.
Yeah, and those stucco masks at Waksuktun, they're really interesting.
And they show that Olmec influence, too.
Which would eventually fade away as the Maya developed their own distinct style.
So now we're in the Classic period, around 300 CE. And this is when Maya civilization really takes off in the P10.
And remember, they're still working with limited technology.
Yeah, no metal tools. But they're perfecting the Corbel vault.
And they're developing these amazing hydraulic systems to manage the water.
They were really good at adapting to their environment. And this is when we see the Altar Stella cult becoming widespread.
And they were using that long count calendar to date their monuments.
Which, as we said, might have originated outside the lowland.
But the Maya, they really took it to another level.
And the earliest dated monument we have is Stela 29 at Tikal from 292 CE.
Now their calendar system, that's something truly unique.
They had two calendars running at the same time.
A 260-day ritual calendar and a 365-day civil calendar.
And every 52 years, they would sync up.
And the Maya realized that this 52-year cycle also coincided with the cycles of Venus.
They were really paying attention to the stars.
Oh yeah, they were tracking the moon, the sun, eclipses.
They were amazing astronomers. And they developed a vigesimal number system, base 20.
With bars and dots.
And they even had a concept of zero.
That's one of only 2 times that happened in the ancient world.
Really puts their achievements into perspective. And they were using all of this to record their history.
Now, we can decipher the dates pretty well.
But the rest of the glyphs, that's still a work in progress.
But scholars like Heinrich Verlin and Tatiana Proskuryakov, they made huge strides.
Figuring out those emblem glyphs and the dynastic histories.
It's really impressive work.
It is. So let's talk about Maya society. At the top, you had the halakh, the ruler.
Often hereditary.
And they were surrounded by nobles who controlled various aspects of society.
And then you had warriors, bureaucrats, artists, and of course, the farmers.
And unfortunately, slaves too.
Yeah. But it seems like in the early classic period, the system was a bit more fluid.
So people could move up in society.
And gain access to luxury goods and prestige.
And as the classic period progressed, we see these stelae with long count dates appearing all over the lowlands.
It started around Tikal and then spread out from there.
And by the late classic period, there was this intricate network of trade connecting all these cities.
They were trading all kinds of things. Volcanic stone, obsidian, jade, chert.
And salt, of course, that was essential.
And they have these regional specializations. Some areas focused on textiles, others on ceramics.
And then you had cacao, that was like their currency.
The drink of the elite.
But it's interesting because a lot of these resources came from areas outside the main Maya centers.
So they must have had a pretty sophisticated system for managing all of that.
And it seems like they weren't really giving much back to those peripheral areas.
Maybe some luxury goods and the prestige of being associated with the Maya.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about their social structure.
Definitely. Now, the art of this period, it was becoming more refined, more coherent.
And we're starting to get a better understanding of their history, thanks to those stelae tombs.
Like at Tikal, we have this ruler called Curl Snout.
Curl Snout, what a name.
And he's depicted on Stela 4, sitting on this throne, wearing these Mexican-style headdresses.
Showing that Teotihuacan influence.
Right. And he's holding this Maya mask and another one that might represent Tlaloc.
Interesting.
And at the top of the stela, there's this deity face that might be Chak or the mannequin scepter.
So it's like he's trying to legitimize his power by connecting to both Maya and Mexican traditions.
It's a clever strategy, and it's during his reign that we see the custom of commemorating the end of each Khotun becoming really important.
With the erection of stelae.
Right, like Stela 18, which was erected in 396 CE.
And some scholars think this was a way to blend Mexican and Maya calendrical traditions.
And to make the ritual calendar more accessible to the people.
And we also find Teotihuacan-style objects in Curl Snout's tomb.
So that Mexican influence was definitely there.
But then, his successor, Stormy Sky, he seems to have brought back more of the Maya traditions.
While still acknowledging his Mexican heritage.
And we see that in Stela 31.
Where he's shown with his Mexican warriors.
But he's dressed in Maya clothing.
Yeah, and his tomb is also mostly Maya in style.
So he's striking a balance.
Exactly. And after him, we see this kind of lull in monumental activity during the Middle Classic.
Maybe because of political instability?
Right. It's possible that power was shared between 2 figures.
One from the old Maya aristocracy.
And another one who was more focused on external affairs.
And, meanwhile, Kaminal-Juyu in the highlands was becoming more Mexicanized.
It became Teotihuacan's main outpost in the south.
And there was this important trade route running from there to Teotihuacan.
Carrying all sorts of goods.
Yeah.
Shells, feathers, jade, cacao.
And Teotihuacan was sending back obsidian and ceramics
They were really interested in controlling that cacao trade.
because it was so valuable.
Exactly. And we find tons of Teotihuacan-style objects in the area around Kamaljiu.
Okay, so then we get to the late Classic period, which is when the Maya civilization really reached its peak.
This is the time of the greatest splendor and diversity.
And it's interesting because power wasn't centralized in one place,
No, it was spread out among all these independent city-states.
kind of like the Greek city-states.
Right. And the rainforest was like their Mediterranean Sea.
It's difficult to navigate.
And they were founding colonies, too.
And their wealth came from trade and the production of luxury goods.
But they still had to figure out how to survive in their local environments.
So they developed all these different agricultural techniques, terracing, raised fields.
And they were really good at utilizing resources like breadfruit.
And some scholars think that some areas had to import maize from other areas to feed their population.
Like maybe Tikal was getting maize from Rio Bec.
So it was a complex system.
And incredibly diverse. You have sites like Palenque, Copan, Piedras Negras, Yaxchilan.
Uxmal, Chichen Itza, they all have their own unique styles.
But within that diversity, there was also a shared cultural foundation.
So let's focus on Tikal again. After that lull in the Middle Classic, things really picked up in the Late Classic.
There was this renewed dynamism. They were making their religious practices more accessible to the people.
And the ball game was becoming more popular.
Maybe even a public spectacle.
And then you have these two rulers, Ruler A and Ruler B,
Who reigned during Tikal's golden age.
from 681 to 768 CE.
And ruler A, he seems to have been very deliberate in connecting himself to the past.
His enthronement was linked to stormy skies 13 Katuns earlier.
And the Maya, they believed in this cyclical view of history.
So it's like he was trying to say, I'm part of this grand tradition.
And he also brought back some of those Mexican elements.
Like those feathered headdresses.
And even some architectural features.
But that didn't stop them from developing their own unique style.
No, they took those influences and made them their own. And architecturally, things were getting really ambitious.
They built those massive temples. Temples the Lurzen too.
Dominating the Great Plaza.
Temple 6 with that tall roof cone.
And Temple of First, the Temple of the Giant Jaguar.
That's the classic Tikal temple, with that steep pyramid and the narrow sanctuary.
And those beautiful wooden lintels inside.
It's really a masterpiece. And Temple V, that one's even taller, but with just one tiny room.
And then there's Temple 4.
That one's huge.
One of the tallest structures in Mesoamerica. And imagine what it must have been like to see those temples rising up out of the rainforest.
Just incredible.
Yeah, those pyramids with those elaborate roof combs, the incense, the sounds.
Must have been awe-inspiring.
Definitely. And Tikal wasn't just building temples, they were expanding the whole city.
Thousands of structures packed into a relatively small area.
They had avenues, plazas, palaces.
And it wasn't all perfectly planned out like Teotihuacan,
No, it was more organic.
but it still had that sense of harmony. And it wasn't just Tikal. Other cities were also reaching their peak.
Like at Yaxha.
And Jibil-Chiltern.
And each region had its own unique style. Like in the Rio de la Pasión Basin, they had these really dynamic sculptures.
And those amazing stelae at La Amelia.
And that area was like a crossroads connecting different parts of the Maya world.
And then you have the Usumacinta region with Piedras Negras, Yaxchilan, and Palenque.
All very different from each other. Piedras Negras, they were masters of relief carving.
And their stelae, they often depicted historical events.
Like Stela 12 with those prisoners.
Lintel 3 with that council meeting.
And then Yaxchilan, they were known for their lintels.
They had those amazing historical narratives carved on them.
And those lintels tell us a lot about the Jaguar dynasty.
And Palenque, they had this unique architectural style that focused on interior space.
Like the temples of the cross and the sun.
And the palace with a tower.
And of course the temple of the inscriptions with Pakal's tomb.
Okay, so then we have the Motagua Basin with Copan and Quirigua.
Copan, that was a major center for astronomy.
And they were aligning their structures with the stars.
Yeah, like Stelae 10 and 12 and Temple 22.
In Quirigua, they have those giant stelae.
Some of the tallest in the Maya world.
And then in the western Maya area, you have Calakmul and those jade figurines from the cenotes.
Really beautiful pieces.
And then north of Piton, you have the Rio Bec and Chines regions.
Rio Bec, that's where you find those strange towers.
That look like temples but aren't actually functional.
Right, they were probably symbolic. And they also had those open jaw portals.
Which you also see in the Chines region.
And in the Pook region, too.
Like at Uxmal.
And even at Tikal and Copan. So there was a stylistic exchange going on.
And the Puc region, that's where you see that really geometric style.
Very different from the more sensual style of the central area.
Yeah, it's like two sides of Maya art.
And the Puc architecture, it's really all about those cubic volumes and the intricate decoration.
Like the governor's palace at Uxmal.
A masterpiece of that style.
It is. But unfortunately, this period of greatness didn't last forever. Starting in the late 8th century, we see the decline of the classic Maya civilization.
Fewer and fewer cities were erecting stelae to mark the end of the Katuns.
It's like the slow death of a civilization. And some scholars think that a group called the Putun might have played a role in this.
They were from the Western Maya area.
And they had adopted a lot of Mexican cultural elements.
And they were skilled seafarers and traders.
So they were able to spread their influence. And they might have even conquered some cities, like Piedras Negras and Yaxchilan.
And they had a presence at Tikal and Ceibal, too.
But even they couldn't stop the decline. And at Tikal, we see this really sad end to the classic period.
They built Temple III in 810.
Maybe as a last gasp of grandeur.
And then a stela in 869. And after that, nothing.
Just silence.
And the city was partially abandoned. The old elite lost their power.
People were looting the tombs.
And they were even using pieces of stelae as grinding stones.
They had lost their connection to the past.
And the classic order was gone.
It's a tragic end, but the causes are still debated.
Natural disasters, maybe like droughts or floods.
Or maybe human factors like wars or internal conflicts.
Or maybe a combination of both.
And some even suggest that the Maya might have abandoned their cities because of their own prophecies.
It's a fascinating and complex question.
It is. And only a few cities survived the collapse.
Like Uxmal and Chichen Itza in the north.
Barton Ramey in the east.
Coatzamalhuapa in the south.
And outside the...
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.